a man feared throughout the Frostpine Mountains, a woman nobody would even glance at. When two outcasts meet amidst the harshest winter in the mountain range's history, no one suspected they would be the ones to change everything. If you think life is only for the lucky few, watch this whole story. Like to support the channel and comment the name of the city you're watching from. I want to know how far my story has come. The letter had promised a husband. It had not promised this. Maeve Holloway stood at the tree line where the trail gave out and the mountain began in earnest, her trunk sitting half buried in a foot of early snow, one of its brass latches broken from the fall off the wagon 2 miles back. Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. Her boots, good boots, the best she'd owned, had a split along the left heel that had been letting in cold water since mid-morning. She couldn't feel 3 of her toes on her right foot, and the light was going fast, the sky turning that particular shade of pewter that meant more snow before nightfall. She looked up at the mountain. Somewhere up there, according to the letter in her coat pocket, was the homestead of one Ronan Voss, 41 years old, widower, owns land free and clear, seeks a practical woman for practical purposes. The phrasing had not been warm. The man who'd written the advertisement through the Clearwater Matrimonial Registry, or more likely dictated it to someone who then wrote it down, had apparently used the word practical 3 times in 6 sentences. Maeve had circled each one in pencil and found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind it. She was 33 years old, had been turned down by 9 men in 2 years through the same registry, and had stopped expecting warmth from strangers somewhere around the 4th rejection. The 4th one had said, politely but plainly, that he'd been hoping for someone more suited to the physical demands of frontier life. She had read that sentence 3 times before she understood what he meant. Then she'd understood exactly what he meant. She picked up the trunk by its remaining handle, got it off the ground, and started up the mountain. The town of Dunmore Flats sat at the base of the Frostpine Range, the way a man sits at the edge of something he doesn't want to fall into, present, but careful about it. It had a general store, a feed mill, a rooming house with 6 rooms and a leaky roof, and a population of about 200 souls who had all, in one way or another, made peace with the fact that they lived within sight of Ronan Voss's smoke. You could see it most mornings, a thin gray line rising from somewhere up in the tree break above the 3rd ridge. In summer it was easy to forget about. In winter, when everything else was white and still, that smoke was a reminder. The reminder being, he's still up there. Maeve had arrived in Dunmore Flats 2 days prior on the southbound stage, which had been late by a full day due to a wheel problem outside of Garfield Crossing. She'd spent that delay in a way station with 5 other passengers, one of whom had been genuinely pleasant, and 3 of whom had found reasons to shift their weight away from her on the bench. She had eaten the biscuits she'd packed in her bag and looked out the window and not said anything she'd regret. In Dunmore Flats, she'd taken a room at the rooming house. The woman who ran it, a thin widow named Mrs. Creel, had given her a look at the door that Maeve had learned to read as easily as large print, and she'd spent one evening asking careful questions of the people she encountered. What she learned about Ronan Voss came in pieces, the way all small-town knowledge comes. A sentence here, a hesitation there, a dropped voice when someone's husband or neighbor walked past. He had come to the Frostpine Range 14 years ago. Nobody knew exactly where from. He'd built his homestead on the upper slope, 40 acres, good timber, a creek that ran cold all year, and he'd made it clear from the start that he didn't want visitors. 3 men had gone up there in the early years to discuss the matter of property lines, and 2 had come back without finishing their sentences. The 3rd had come back with a broken arm, though the full story on that was disputed. His wife, he'd had a wife briefly, in the first years, had left, or died. The accounts differed. The subject made people look at the floor. He was 6'4", possibly taller, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. He had hands that could do damage. He did not come to town. He did not socialize. He sent a boy named Cully down once a month with a list of supplies and the money to pay for them, and Cully would come back up with whatever the list required and not much else. He put a man through a fence, offered the farrier's apprentice, a kid of about 17 who was very clearly enjoying himself. Year before last, fellow from the mining survey tried to walk his property without asking. Was the man badly hurt? Maeve asked. Broke his collarbone. Did the man ask permission? The apprentice blinked. What? Did the surveyor ask permission before walking the property? O baltaki shakamkin. Well, that's not really the... Never mind, Maeve said. She thanked him and went back to her room and read the letter again. Practical woman. Practical purposes. She had, over the past 2 days, gathered that the matrimonial registry advertisement was a surprise to most of Dunmore Flats. A few people seemed to find it funny. The woman at the dry goods counter had actually laughed. A short, private laugh she tried to cover with a cough, when Maeve mentioned who she was there to see. You'll want to go back home, Mrs. Creel told her that evening, setting down a bowl of soup that was mostly water with some intentions in it. Wherever home is. I'll see him first. He doesn't see people. He put an advertisement in a registry, Maeve said. That's a form of wanting to be seen. Mrs. Creel looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face that wasn't quite pity. It was more like the look you give someone who doesn't know yet what they're walking toward. He's not right, she said finally. Up here. She touched 2 fingers to her temple. Maeve ate her soup and didn't argue. The trail up the mountain was not a road. It had been a road once, or something close to it. You could see the line of it under the snow if you knew what to look for, the slight depression where boots and wagon wheels had pressed the earth down over years. But it hadn't been maintained, and in the upper sections it became mostly a suggestion, a general direction, a vote of confidence from whoever had carved it. That a person could, in theory, get from here to there. Maeve had gotten directions from the boy, Cully, whom she'd found outside the general store early that morning. He was 11 or 12, small and serious-faced, with the particular watchfulness of a child who had learned that adults were not always reliable. He'd looked at her trunk, then at the snow on the trail above them, and then at her. It's a hard walk, he said. I imagine so. He won't be happy about it. Probably not. Cully had chewed on that for a moment. Then he'd given her very precise directions, repeated twice, and told her to watch for the blaze marks on the birch trees at the second fork, because the left trail looked right, but wasn't. She'd thanked him, and he'd nodded, still with that serious face, and she'd had the distinct impression that he thought she was either very brave or very foolish, and hadn't yet decided which. She thought it might be both. The trunk was heavy. She stopped twice in the first mile to rest her arms, setting it down in the snow and working the feeling back into her fingers. The cold was a serious kind of cold, the kind that didn't bluster or gust, but simply sat on everything with its full weight. Her breath came out in thick clouds. The trees up here were old, frost pine mostly, heavy and dark, the kind of trees that didn't move in the wind so much as absorb it. The light between them was dim and blue-gray, and the snow fell from a sky she couldn't quite see. She found the blaze marks. She took the right fork. The trail climbed harder after that, and her lungs started to argue with her. She was not a small woman. She knew that. She had known it since she was 12 years old, and her mother's sister had taken her aside at a family gathering and explained in gentle, terrible terms that Maeve would need to work harder than other girls at certain things. She had spent 20 years understanding exactly what that meant and exactly which things. Walking up a mountain in deep snow with a broken trunk was one of those things. She did it anyway. She had a fair bit of practice at doing things anyway. She was breathing hard and her left heel was genuinely painful, and the light was getting thin when she saw the smoke. Not a thin line this time. Actual smoke, gray and heavy, rising from somewhere just above and ahead. And then the smell. Wood smoke and something else. Animal hide, maybe. The smell of a place that had been lived in hard and practical through many winters. She came out of the trees into a clearing and stopped. The homestead was not what she'd expected, though she'd tried not to expect much. It was a cabin, a real one, not a shack, built from heavy timber with the logs fitted tight and a roof that had a proper pitch to it, steep enough to shed snow. There was a barn set back to the left, solid and dark, and a lean-to structure beside it that held split firewood stacked head-high and running the full length of the wall. A smokehouse, a root cellar, its angled door half visible under a drift. The clearing itself had been worked. You could see the old furrow lines under the snow, the remnant shapes of a garden that had been real and productive before the cold set in. None of this was visible from Dunmore Flats, she realized. None of it. She stood there for a moment, getting her breath back and taking it in, and she was still standing there when the cabin door opened. Oh, he did not come out slowly. He came out the way something comes out when it has been watching the tree line for a while and has finally decided to stop watching and deal with whatever's there. Ronan Voss was everything the descriptions had said, and several things they hadn't. He was very tall, not exaggerated tall, not performance tall, but the kind of tall that meant every doorway in that cabin had probably been modified at some point. He had on a coat that had been heavy once, and was heavier now from years of use, and he was carrying an axe in his right hand, not threateningly, just the way a man carries an axe when he's been splitting wood and heard something in the tree line. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, longer than fashionable, and not particularly concerned about that. The scar was there, yes, left ear to jaw, raised and pale against skin that had been weathered by years at altitude. His face, as he looked at her, was not readable. "You're on my land," he said. His voice was low, not a shout, but it carried in the cold air without any trouble at all. "I know," Maeve said. "I'm Maeve Holloway. You wrote to the Clearwater Matrimonial Registry." Silence. He looked at her, then at the trunk, then back at her. "You walked up," he said. It was not quite a question. "The trail ends at the second ridge. I didn't see another option." Another silence. He had very dark eyes. She couldn't tell the exact color in this light. And they were doing the same thing the farrier's apprentice's eyes had done, the same thing most people's eyes did. They moved. A quick inventory. The width of her shoulders, the fullness of her face, the way her coat sat on her frame. She stood still and let him do it and kept her own face neutral. Because she had been doing this since she was 12 years old, and she was very tired of flinching. "The letter said practical," she said. "I took it to mean neither of us was going to waste the other's time with pretending, so I'll ask you plainly, do you want me to turn around or do you want to let me in out of the cold?" He was quiet for a long moment. The snow had started again. Not heavy, just a few flakes sifting down through the still air, the kind of snow that doesn't announce itself. "Come in," he said, and turned back to the door. The inside of the cabin was warm. Genuinely, thoroughly warm, the kind of warm that hits you in the face when you come in from real cold. There was a hearth along the left wall with a fire going that had clearly been burning for hours. A good fire, well built, not just for show. The room was large. He'd need it to be at that height, and it was sparse but not empty. A table, heavy and scarred. 2 chairs, a bench along the wall. Shelves with tools and supplies arranged with no aesthetic intention but a clear functional logic. A rifle above the door. Skins hung on 2 of the walls, not decorative, drying. The floor was plank wood, uneven but clean. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something cooking, something in a pot on the hearth that she couldn't identify but which smelled better than the soup at Mrs. Creel's. Ronan set the axe by the door and didn't offer to take her coat. She took it off herself and hung it on the peg that was clearly meant for a coat because there was only one peg, and it was at door height. He went to the fire and crouched beside it with the particular ease of someone who spent a lot of time at floor level, and he added a piece of wood without looking at her. "Sit," he said. She sat at the table. She was still wet through in several places, and her left heel was throbbing, and she was more tired than she'd been in a long time, but she sat up straight and kept her hands flat on the table and waited. He didn't say anything for a while. He was looking at the fire. "How'd you find Cully?" he asked finally. "Outside the general store, he gave me good directions." He shouldn't have. He was trying to be helpful. "He's 11. He did it better than most adults would have," Maeve said, "including giving me the warning about the left fork, which I suspect would have been a real problem." Something shifted in Ronan's face. Not quite a smile, not close to a smile, actually, but a slight loosening around the jaw, the ghost of some expression that had probably been easier to access before whatever had happened to make him the man he was now. "Left fork goes to a drop," he said. 40 feet. People who don't know the mountain try it in the snow. "Have any tried it?" "One," he said. "Survived. Mostly." The fire popped. Outside, the wind had started to pick up, and Maeve could hear it moving through the frost pines, that particular low moan they made when they took a real wind. It was getting colder out there. She was glad, in a plain and uncomplicated way, to be in here. "You should tell me why you answered," Ronan said. He was still looking at the fire. "I need a situation," Maeve said. "A real one. I have some money. Not a lot, but enough to be useful. And I know how to work. I can cook properly, and I can keep accounts, and I've got 2 hands, and I'm not afraid of cold or hard labor. I've been turned down by 9 men in 2 years, and I'm not interested in trying for a 10th. You wrote to the registry, which means you need something too. I thought we might be useful to each other." Now he looked at her, directly, steadily, the way he'd looked at the tree line before he came out. "What were the 9 reasons?" he asked. She hadn't expected that. "What? 9 men, 9 reasons they turned you down, or 1 reason, 9 times?" She held his gaze. 1 reason, 9 times. He nodded slowly, and she couldn't read what the nod meant, and she decided she didn't need to read it. She'd said what was true. He could do with it what he chose. "The registry letter," she said. "You didn't write it yourself." It wasn't a question. He looked mildly irritated. "Cully's mother. She writes well. She has opinions about my situation." "She's probably right," Maeve said. He looked at her for a second with that unreadable dark gaze. Then he stood up, went to the hearth, and came back with 2 tin cups and set them on the table. Coffee, or something close to it. He sat down across from her, the chair creaking significantly under him, and wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. It didn't come out like a warning exactly, more like something he thought she should know. "I'm not easy to look at, by most accounts," Maeve said. "We might be even." That wasn't quite a smile either, but it was closer. Something moved in his eyes that wasn't hostility and wasn't pity, and was, she thought, possibly the beginning of something honest. "There are rules," he said. "Tell me." He talked for close to an hour. It was not comfortable conversation, and it wasn't meant to be. He was direct in the way of a man who had stopped wasting words sometime in his middle 30s and never started again. He told her about the homestead, the 40 acres, the water rights to the creek, the state of the barn roof, the root cellar stores, the state of the animals. 2 horses, 3 goats, a dozen hens that had been unproductive since early October. He told her what the winters were like, not in the sense of describing them, but in the sense of accounting for what they cost. How much wood, how much food, how much of everything. He was precise about it, the way a man is precise when the difference between precision and imprecision is whether or not you eat in February. He told her about the town. "They don't like me," he said flatly. "I noticed. They'll like you less for being here. They don't know me well enough to like me yet. They'll have to work up to the other thing." He looked at her. "You're not worried?" "I've been disliked before," Maeve said. "It doesn't take the feeling out of my fingers." He drank his coffee, set the cup down, looked at the table. "My wife," he said, then stopped. She waited. "She left 4 years ago. I'm not what she wanted. I knew that before, and I waited too long to act on it." He said this in a very flat voice, the voice of something he'd said to himself enough times that he'd worn all the feeling out of it. I'm not offering." He stopped again. "I understand," Maeve said. "Neither am I." He looked at her again. "You're not offended." "Should I be?" "Some women would be. Some women came here expecting something different." She wrapped her own hands around her cup, which was cooling fast. "I came here expecting a working arrangement with a man who needed one. I think that's what you're describing." "That's what I'm describing." "Then we understand each other." The fire had burned down while they talked, and Ronan got up and fed it without ceremony, and Maeve looked around the cabin in the firelight and thought about what would need to be done and in what order. The shelves were functional, but inefficient, the way a man alone organizes things, where everything has a reason but no system. The cooking equipment was sparse and poorly placed. The table needed to be moved 4 feet to the left, which would open up the work area near the hearth, and also let 2 people sit at it without the bench being pressed against the wall. Small things, starting out things, the kind of things you notice when you're thinking about a place as somewhere you might actually live. "I'll need a room," she said. "Or a space, Whatever you have. He nodded toward a door at the back of the cabin she hadn't noticed, half hidden by the hanging skins. Back room. It's cold. Chimney wall helps, but you'll need the extra blankets from the chest. That's fine. You'll want to see it before you decide. I'll see it, but I'm not going back down that mountain tonight, Maeve said. It's dark and it's snowing and my heel is split. Whatever I decide, it's decided in the morning. He looked at her. A look that had something in it she couldn't quite name, some minor recalibration of whatever he'd been expecting. And then he said, "There's elk stew." "I could eat," she said. They ate without much talk. The stew was better than she'd expected. He knew how to cook for himself, which she'd half doubted, and the bread that went with it was yesterday's but still good enough. She ate fully and without apology, which she'd learned was the only sensible approach, because the alternative was performing a daintiness she didn't feel and hadn't the energy for. He watched her eat, not rudely, not with the inventory eye, just the way a person watches someone in their space for the first time, cataloging presents, adjusting to the fact of another human being in a room that hadn't had one in a while. After supper, she helped clear, and he didn't tell her not to, and she washed the tin in a basin of water he heated at the fire, and he banked the fire for the night, and they moved around each other in the small space with a little more ease than she'd have predicted an hour ago. "The back room," he said, nodding at the door. She took the lamp he offered and went through. It was cold. He hadn't been wrong about that, but it was not intolerable, and the chimney wall was warm to the touch. There was a rope bed with a cornhusk mattress that had seen better years, and a chest at the foot of it that, when she opened it, produced 3 heavy wool blankets that smelled of cedar and considerable time. A single window, shuttered tight against the cold. A peg on the wall. A small wooden stool. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots, flinching when the left one came free, and looked at the room in the lamplight. It was not much. She thought of the rooming house in Dunmore Flats, Mrs. Creel's watery soup, the woman at the dry goods counter who had laughed into her hand. She thought of the 9 letters, each with their various careful phrasings around a single blunt truth. She thought of the trail up the mountain, the way the snow had felt on her face when the second wind started, the way her lungs had burned and her arms had ached with the trunk, and she'd kept going anyway because stopping in those conditions was not an option she was willing to accept. She made the bed with the 3 blankets, layering them the way her grandmother had taught her, and she lay down without undressing except for her boots, and she pulled the blankets up to her chin. Outside the shuttered window, the wind worked through the frost pines. Inside, the chimney wall radiated a slow, steady heat. She was still there in the morning. What? The first week was not easy and not comfortable, and she wouldn't have called it a success by any measure except the one that mattered, which was that at the end of it, she was still there. She found the gaps in the homestead's organization the way you find gaps in anything, by looking for what was missing and working backward. The root cellar stores were better than she'd feared, adequate for the winter if they were careful, short on variety but not on substance. The hens were not laying because their coop had a gap in the north wall that let in cold air at night, and she fixed it with a piece of split board and a handful of nails she found in a coffee tin on the second shelf. The hens laid 2 eggs the next morning. Ronan looked at them on the table without saying anything, but he ate them. The goats needed their hooves trimmed. She did it herself, having done it before on her uncle's farm, because she didn't ask Ronan for things she could manage herself. He came by while she was finishing the 3rd one and stood in the barn doorway with his arms crossed and watched. "You've done that before," he said. "My uncle raised goats. I spent 2 summers there when I was young." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been putting it off." "I noticed." He didn't look particularly embarrassed. "I don't like goats." "I don't think you have to like them," Maeve said, working her thumbnail into the edge of the hoof. "You just have to keep their feet right." "They have personalities," he said, in a tone that indicated he found this unreasonable in an animal. "This one does," she agreed. "She thinks she's in charge. She might be right." That was the closest she'd seen to an actual laugh from him. Not a laugh exactly, more of a reluctant exhale through his nose, and she filed it away without making anything of it. He did not talk about himself. She didn't ask him to. She could see in the construction of the homestead and the organization of his days. the outline of a man who had been deeply self-sufficient for a very long time, and who trusted that self-sufficiency far more than he trusted other people. She understood that at some distance. She didn't share it. She liked people, or had, before people gave her enough reasons not to. But she understood it. What she noticed was that he watched her work without interfering with it, which she appreciated. He had opinions about how things should be done, and he expressed them, but when she pushed back, which she did, when she thought she was right, he didn't bulldoze. He listened. He didn't always agree, but he listened. On the fourth day, she moved the table 4 feet to the left. He came in from outside and stopped in the doorway and looked at the table in its new position and then at her. "Better," she said, before he could say anything. "Now 2 people can sit at it without one of them being wedged against the wall. Also gives me room to work at the hearth without turning sideways." He looked at it for another moment. It was there because the floorboard has a soft spot on the left side. She'd stepped on the soft spot that morning. "I know. It needs to be fixed." "It does," he said, and went and sat at the table in its new position and didn't say another word about it. But them. She went down to Dunmore Flats on the 5th day for supplies, which needed doing and which she knew would not be entirely comfortable. Ronan had given her the list and the money, the exact amount, counted out and placed in a cloth pouch, which she respected, and she'd taken the trail down in the morning when it was cold and clear. The town received her in the way she'd expected. It wasn't open hostility, it was something more practiced. The small social management of someone the community had decided, collectively and without discussion, was a problem. Looks that slid sideways. A conversation that stopped and restarted when she approached. The woman at the dry goods counter, a Mrs. Adder, who took her list without meeting her eyes and filled it without comment, and then, as she was wrapping the last package, said in a pleasant voice that was not actually pleasant, "You're still up there." "I am," Maeve said. "People were sure you'd come down after the first night." "People were wrong." Mrs. Adder handed over the packages. "You know what he is," she said. The pleasant voice had dropped a register. "What he's done. You know he put a man half to death 3 years ago, Weston Hale, for crossing his land." "I heard about the collarbone," Maeve said. "I also heard Weston Hale was part of a survey team walking property they had no right to walk. What was Weston Hale supposed to be doing on that land?" Mrs. Adder blinked. That's not the point. I think it might be part of the point," Maeve said. She picked up the packages. They were heavier than comfortable, but she'd managed the trunk up the mountain. She could manage these. "Thank you for the supplies." She was at the door when another voice said from behind her, "He'll hurt you. Sooner or later, that's just what he does." She turned around. The voice belonged to a man she didn't know, middle-aged, the soft look of a man who handled money rather than labor, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee. He was watching her with the calm confidence of a man who expected to be believed. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled, not nicely. "Gareth Holt. I have interests in this valley." She didn't know the name yet. She would. "Mr. Holt," she said. "If I need your assessment of my circumstances, I'll ask for it." She walked out. The wind was picking up on the trail back, and the packages were heavy, and her heel was still sore. She climbed steadily, watching the blaze marks on the birch trees, and did not think about Gareth Holt's smile, or Mrs. Adder's pleasant, unpleasant voice, or any of the sideways looks, because there was no profit in thinking about them right now. She thought instead about the soft floorboard and what it would take to fix it, and whether the chimney wall in the back room lost heat at the joint she'd noticed, and whether the hen coop would hold through the first serious storm of the season. She came out of the trees into the clearing, and Ronan was outside splitting wood, and he saw her and did not come over to help with the packages, which she hadn't expected and wouldn't have wanted, but he stopped splitting and waited until she got close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. "Everything on the list," she said. He took the heavier of the 2 parcels without asking. "Trouble?" She thought about it for a second. "A man named Gareth Holt," she said. "He was at the store. Told me you'd hurt me." Ronan's face did something complicated that she didn't have enough information to read yet. He turned and carried the parcel toward the cabin. "Holt," he said. His voice had a flatness to it that was different from his usual quiet. "What did you say?" "That if I wanted his assessment, I'd ask for it." He held the cabin door open for her. It was the first time he'd done that. "He has people," Ronan said. "Hired people. I gathered he had money. More than money." He set the parcel on the table. The table in its new position, the soft floorboard 3 feet to the right of where they stood. He looked at it for a moment. "He's been trying to buy this land for 2 years." Maeve set her parcel down. "What's on the land?" Ronan looked at her. "I don't know exactly. He hasn't said exactly. That's the part that worries me." She thought about that. She thought about Gareth Holt's smile and his certainty, the particular confidence of a man who was used to waiting out problems until they resolved themselves. She thought about Ronan up here on this mountain, alone for years, with that kind of patience working against him from below. "We should find out," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "We," he said. Not a challenge. More like a word he was getting used to the weight of. "We," she said. She pulled off her coat and hung it on the peg. "But first I need to fix that floorboard. Do you have a hammer and a decent board in the barn?" He looked at her for another second with those dark eyes, and whatever was behind them, and then he said, "I'll get them." By the end of the second week, the back room was warmer and the hens were laying reliably, and the table was in the right place, and the soft floorboard had been replaced with a piece of ash plank that Ronan had cut to size without being asked twice. They were not close. That was not the word for it. But they had begun to develop a functional language. The language of people who share a space and share the work of it, who learn each other's edges and begin to navigate them without constant collision. He knew that she woke early and worked quietly and didn't want conversation before she'd had her coffee. She knew that he disappeared into the forest for 2 or 3 hours most afternoons, and that this was not something to ask about, and that he came back more settled than when he left. They ate together. They talked about what needed doing and what they'd done. Sometimes, in the evenings, he talked about the mountain. Not feelings, not history, just the mountain itself, the way the weather moved across it, the trails he knew, the places the elk ran. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them. One evening, he asked her where she was from, and she told him, a small town in the flat country, east of the big river, a kind of place that was neither prosperous nor miserable, just relentlessly ordinary. She told him about her parents, her father's dry goods shop, her mother's competence, the way they'd been practical people in a practical life. She told him about the 2 summers at her uncle's farm, the goats, the work she'd liked. She did not tell him about the 9 letters. He didn't ask. But near the end of the evening, the fire burning low and the wind working at the shutters, he said, without looking up from the harness he was mending, whatever they said, the men, it was their loss. She didn't say anything for a moment. "It was a setback," she said finally. "Not a judgment." He looked up. "Yes," he said. "That's the right way to think about it." And then he went back to the harness, and she went back to the account book she'd been updating, the one that had been full of errors before she'd found it in the chest and started correcting it. And they sat in the warm cabin on the mountain with the wind outside and the fire low, and it was quiet in the way that quiet sometimes is between 2 people who have found, without exactly looking for it, that they don't need to fill the silence. On the 20th day, Cully came up the mountain. He arrived just after mid-morning, breathing hard from the trail, his face red with cold and something else, urgency maybe, or fear at the edges of urgency. Ronan was outside when he came into the clearing and Maeve was at the hearth, and she heard voices and came to the door. "Holt's men," Cully said, bent forward with his hands on his knees, getting his breath. 3 of them. "They were at the store this morning talking to Mr. Briggs. I heard it through the wall. They were asking about..." He looked up at Ronan. "About what's under the north field, the one by the creek." Ronan's face had gone very still. "Under it?" Maeve stepped out of the doorway. "Something about what the rock is," Cully said, standing up straight. "I don't know. One of them said... He said it was worth more than the whole valley put together. That's what he said." The 3 of them stood in the clearing in the cold. The snow had stopped overnight, and the sky was hard and blue, and the frost pines stood completely still in the windless morning. Maeve looked at Ronan. His jaw was set and his hands were loose at his sides, and he was looking at the northern tree line with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, exactly. Something older than anger. The look of a man who has been waiting for a particular kind of bad news and has just received confirmation that it's real. They're going to come for it, she said. Not a question. They're going to try, Ronan said. Cully looked at him, then at Maeve with that careful, serious face. My mother says you should be careful, he said. She says Holt has more friends in this valley than you think, and that some of them wear badges. The wind came then, a single gust that moved through the frost pines and was gone, and in the silence after it, Maeve could hear the creek below the north field, running cold under its shelf of ice, running over whatever was in the rock beneath it. Thank you, Cully, she said. Come inside and get warm before you go back down. He came inside, and while he drank the hot cider she heated for him at the fire, and while Ronan stood at the cabin door looking out at the mountain and the hard blue sky, she began thinking, not about running. She had not come up this mountain to run. She thought about what Gareth Holt's certainty had looked like, standing at the store counter with his coffee, watching her walk out. She thought about Mrs. Adder's pleasant, unpleasant voice, and the men whose names she didn't yet know who had been asking about the Northfield's rock. She thought about what was needed. Not a man's fight, not a last stand. Something more durable than that. She poured Cully more cider and she put a piece of wood on the fire, and she started thinking about who else in this valley had reason to know what Gareth Holt was. Cully left before noon, slipping back down the trail with his collar turned up and his serious face pointed toward the valley. Maeve watched him go from the cabin doorway and then turned back inside where Ronan was standing at the table looking at nothing in particular with the concentrated stillness of a man working something through. The North Field, she said. You've never had it tested. No reason to. He pulled out the bench and sat down. It's rock. Good rock for building, maybe. I used some of it for the barn foundation. What kind of rock? Hard, dark, runs in a seam along the creek bank. He looked up at her. Why would Holt care about rock? I don't know yet. She sat down across from him. But men who hire other men to ask questions about it aren't asking out of curiosity. Whatever it is, it has a price. And if Holt already knows the price, then we're already behind. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come back, moving through the trees in long, slow pulses. There was a man, he said, came through 3 years ago, passed himself off as a traveling merchant, spent 2 days in town. I saw him once from a distance. He was up by the creek, and I walked him off the property, and he went without argument. A pause. I didn't think much of it. Holt sent him. Probably. So he's been planning this for 3 years. At least, Ronan said. He said it flatly, without particular bitterness, the way he said most things that had bitterness in them, as if expressing it would cost more than it was worth. Maeve thought about that. 3 years of patience from a man like Gareth Holt meant either that whatever was under that rock was worth waiting for, or that he'd been waiting for the right circumstances. Waiting, perhaps, for a man alone on a mountain to become isolated enough, tired enough, or cornered enough to sell at a bad price. She thought about all the small ways that kind of waiting could be used. The looks in the store, the conversations that stopped, the accumulated weight of a community that had decided to keep its distance. What did he offer? She asked. When he approached you, $300. For 40 acres. He said the land wasn't productive, said I was sitting on it for sentiment. What did you say? Ronan looked at the table. I told him if he set foot on my property again, I'd put him through a wall. And he smiled, Maeve said. Not a question. Something shifted in Ronan's expression. He smiled. She'd known men like Holt, not this specific version, not a man with hired people and valley interests, but the type. Men who treated other people's anger as confirmation, who took a slammed door as information about where the weak point was and filed it away for later. A man like that didn't stop wanting what he wanted just because you told him no. He just started working a different angle. He'll go to the county, she said. Or he already has. We need to know what the legal situation looks like. Your deed. Do you have it? Ronan got up without answering and went to the back of the cabin. She heard the chest open in the back room, and then he came out with a flat tin box she hadn't seen before. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside, a folded document, a receipt from what looked like a land office, and a small bundle of papers she couldn't read from where she sat. She pulled the deed toward her and unfolded it. It was 12 years old, properly stamped, properly signed, with the description of the property lines in the legal language of the period. She read it twice, slowly. "This is clean," she said. "I paid for it clean." "I know. That doesn't always matter to men like Holt." She folded it again carefully. "He'll look for something wrong with the survey, or he'll argue the creek boundary. The water rights, specifically. If that seam runs along the creek, and if what's in the rock is what I think it might be, then the water rights are what he actually wants, because you need water to process it." Ronan stared at her. "Process what?" "I'm guessing," she said. "But that dark, hard rock in a seam near a water source? I knew a man back home, a mining man, and he used to talk about what to look for. I'm not certain, but I think you might have silver." The words sat on the table between them for a moment. Ronan looked at her with an expression that was not excitement. It was something much closer to the opposite, a kind of recognition, tired and unsurprised, of the way good luck and bad luck tended to arrive in the same package. "Silver," he said, "or lead ore, which is almost as useful for what Holt would want. Either way, it explains the water question and the 3 years of patience." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "If I'd known—" "You'd still have done the same thing," Maeve said. "You came here for land. You built something. The fact that there's something under it doesn't change what you built." He looked at her. She wasn't sure he agreed with that, but he didn't argue it. "What do we do?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked her that directly. She noticed it and didn't make anything of it, just thought about the answer. "You need to get the deed registered again at the county level," she said. "Freshly stamped and witnessed, with the current date. That makes it harder to argue a title dispute after the fact, and we need to find someone who can survey that seam without telling Holt about it. Everyone in Dunmore Flats talks to everyone." "Then we go around Dunmore Flats." She paused. "Cully's mother, the woman who wrote your registry letter. What's she like?" Her name was Nora Pell, and she was a widow of 4 years who ran the only laundry in Dunmore Flats, which meant she knew things about everyone in the valley that they would have preferred she didn't. Maeve came down to town 2 days later on a clear, cold morning and found Nora in the back of the laundry, working a pair of trousers through a wringer with the methodical aggression of a woman who had a lot on her mind. She was small and red-handed and direct, which Maeve appreciated. She looked up when Maeve came in and said, without preamble, "You're still there." "People keep saying that like it's surprising," Maeve said. Nora looked at her for a moment. Not the inventory look, something more level than that. "Cully likes you," she said. "He doesn't like most people. He gave me good directions. I was grateful." "Sit down," Nora said, and nodded at a stool near the stove. She kept working the wringer. "What do you need?" Maeve told her. Not everything, but enough. The seam, the water rights, Holt's 3 years of groundwork. Nora listened without interrupting, which Maeve had learned was the mark of someone who already knew most of what you were telling them and was waiting for the part they didn't. "He bought the Ferris claim last spring," Nora said when Maeve finished. "The 40 acres east of yours, east of Ronan's. Then he bought the Kellner strip in October. He's been buying up around the Frostpine base piece by piece." Maeve thought about that. "He's building a perimeter. That's what it looks like." Nora wrung out the last of the trousers and dropped it in the basket. "He doesn't need to own Ronan's land if he can control every piece around it, control the access, control the water downstream, make it impossible to operate without his cooperation." She dried her hands on a cloth. "The Ferris family didn't want to sell. They were the third family Holt's approach worked on." "What does that mean? His approach worked on?" "He must go to Parsmatain." Nora sat down on the other stool and looked at Maeve with the clear gray eyes of a woman who had been watching the valley a long time. "Holt doesn't threaten people. Not directly. He just makes things harder. A shipment doesn't arrive. A debt gets called in early. A rumor gets started about the quality of a man's work. Nothing you can point at. Nothing you can take to the sheriff." "Who's the sheriff?" "Man named Casper Dole. He's had Holt's money in his pocket since before he was elected." Maeve sat with that for a moment. "So we can't use the law?" "Not locally." Nora folded her hands in her lap. There's a circuit judge who comes through every 3 months. Honest man, I believe. But 3 months is a long time if Holt moves first. Then we need to move first, Maeve said. And we need people. Nora was quiet for a moment. Most people in this valley are afraid of Holt, and most of them are also... She paused, choosing carefully. They've had reasons over the years to avoid trouble with Ronan. Reasons that have mostly been misunderstandings, I think. But misunderstandings accumulate. I know, Maeve said. I'm not asking people to like him. I'm asking them to recognize that what Holt's doing to him, he's been doing to all of them, just more carefully. Nora studied her. You've thought about this. I've had 2 days, Maeve said. Long nights on a mountain. Something in Nora's expression shifted. A kind of appreciation, plain and unsentimental. There are 3 families I can think of who have legitimate grievances against Holt and might be willing to talk. Might, not will. The Pickett family on the South Road. Holt forced their eldest son out of his freighting contract. The Weller brothers, who run the sawmill. Holt tried to buy their water rights last year, and when they refused, he had the county assessor double their property tax. She stood up and picked up the laundry basket. And old Marcus Greer. He's been here since before the town had a name. Holt's been trying to get his grazing land for 2 years. Marcus is stubborn as bad weather, but he's also 71 years old, and he can't manage a long fight alone. Can you get word to them? Maeve asked. Not a meeting yet, just let them know there might be something worth talking about. Nora looked at her steadily. This is going to make things difficult for you, she said, more than they already are. They're already difficult. I mean, Holt has more reach than you know. If he understands that you're the one organizing against him, he'll come after you specifically. Not Ronan, you. Maeve thought about Gareth Holt's smile in the store, the calm patience of it. Let him, she said. Bunk. She told Ronan that evening over the last of the elk stew that she'd spoken to Nora. She laid out what Nora had said, the perimeter Holt was building, the 3 families, the sheriff. She told it plainly, without dramatic framing, the way she'd learned he preferred information to be delivered. He listened without interrupting. At the end he was quiet for a while, turning his cup in his hands. The Pickett boy, he said finally. Teddy Pickett. I had words with his father 2 years ago, over a fence line. What kind of words? The kind where I was right about the fence line and not particularly gentle about saying so. Maeve looked at him. How right were you? Completely right, and I knew it, which made me... He stopped, set the cup down. I wasn't gentle about it. Would Edmund Pickett hold a grudge? Ronan thought about it with the honest consideration he gave most questions. He's a practical man. Prideful, but practical. A pause. If there's a real reason for him, he'd probably set the fence line aside. I think there's a real reason, Maeve said. I'd have to be there, he said. If there's any meeting, I won't ask people to do something on my behalf and not stand there myself. I know. She pushed the empty bowl aside. But you'd need to let me do most of the talking. He looked at her, and she couldn't tell if he was irritated by that or not. You're better at it, he said finally. It cost him something. She could see that. Not pride exactly, more the admission that there were things he wasn't good at, which was a harder thing for some people than admitting failure. I know what I'm like with people. You're direct, she said. That's not the same as being bad at it. Tell that to Edmund Pickett's fence line. She almost laughed. She came close. He noticed. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but the nearest equivalent she'd seen from him in 3 weeks. And he looked at the table and said, The South Road, by the way. If you're going to the Pickett farm, don't take the main trail. Holt has a man who watches the road into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays. How do you know that? Because I've been watching the mountain longer than Holt's been interested in it. He got up and took the bowls to the basin. There's a back way. It comes out below the Pickett property. Takes 20 minutes longer. She looked at his back, the broad set of his shoulders under the heavy shirt, the economy of how he moved in the small space, never wasting motion, always purposeful. She thought about 14 years on this mountain, watching, learning every angle of the terrain and the weather and the valley below. She thought about how that kind of knowledge looked like isolation from the outside and looked like something entirely different from where he was standing. "Ronan," she said. He turned. "Whatever happens with Holt, this is your land. You built it clean and you've kept it 14 years. I want you to know I understand that." She said it directly, without sentiment, because sentiment would have made him dismiss it. "I'm not here to save you from something. I'm here because we have the same problem and it makes more sense to address it together." He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was, as usual, not easy to read, but something in it was different from the way he'd looked at her on the first night, when she'd stood in his clearing with her broken trunk and he'd done his inventory. "I know," he said. "That's why I let you move the table." She stared at him for just a second before she understood that was, in the particular dry language of Ronan Voss, an attempt at a joke. "The table," she said, "is in the right place." "Yes," he said. "It is." He went back to washing the bowls, and she picked up the account book, and the evening settled around them. And outside the frost pines took the night wind the way they always did, without complaint and without yield, and the fire burned steady in the hearth, and neither of them said anything more, which was its own kind of conversation. 10. The trouble came, as trouble often does, not in the form you've been expecting. 12 days after Colley's visit, a group of men came up the mountain. Not Holt's hired hands. Not yet. These were townspeople, 4 of them, with Edmund Pickett in the lead and a man named Dole, the sheriff, walking just behind him, his badge catching what little winter light there was. They came in the early afternoon, and Ronan saw them from the tree line where he'd been checking the fence on the upper pasture, and he came down to the clearing ahead of them. Maeve was in the barn when she heard the voices. She came out and stood in the barn doorway and assessed the situation quickly. 4 men, 1 with a badge, and Ronan standing in the middle of his own clearing with his arms at his sides and that particular set to his jaw. She crossed the yard. The sheriff, Caspar Dole, was a man of about 50, with a good coat that didn't quite match the rest of him. The coat said money, and the rest of him said something older and more weathered and not entirely comfortable with the coat. He had a paper in his hand. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I have a notice here from the county assessor's office. There's a question been raised about your water rights along the North Creek, specifically whether the rights as recorded in your deed cover the full extent of the waterway as it runs through your property." "They do," Ronan said. "It's in the deed." There's been a counterclaim filed. The air in the clearing had gone very still. Maeve positioned herself to Ronan's left, close enough that she was clearly part of whatever was happening, and she looked at Edmund Pickett, middle-aged, sun-worn, with the look of a man who had been told this was a straightforward errand and was beginning to suspect it wasn't. "By whom?" she asked. Dole looked at her without enthusiasm. "By a Mr. Gareth Holt, on behalf of the Frostpine Valley Development Interest." "On what basis?" "Ma'am, I'm delivering a notice." "On what legal basis," she said, "is the counterclaim filed? What specific argument is Mr. Holt making about the water rights?" Dole looked at the paper. He took a moment longer than necessary, and she had the strong impression that he was not a man who had read the paper very carefully before walking up a mountain with it. "He's arguing the deed survey predates the current county water rights framework, and therefore the rights as recorded don't hold under the current code." Maeve looked at Ronan. He was looking at Dole with that flat, contained expression that she now knew was not indifference, but something more combustible than indifference, held carefully in check. "The county water rights framework was updated in 1887, she said. "Mr. Voss's deed is dated 1874. Under the updated framework, all pre-existing registered rights are grandfathered. That's in the county code. Article 12. Dole blinked. "Are you telling me," she said, keeping her voice level, "that Gareth Holt filed a counterclaim that directly contradicts the county code, and your office issued a notice on the basis of it without checking the code?" Dole's jaw tightened. Beside him, Edmund Pickett was looking at the paper in the sheriff's hand with a new expression. Not exactly doubt, but the precursor to it. "The notice requires a response within 30 days, Dole said, retreating into the formality of it. "That's all I'm delivering." "Noted," Maeve said. "We'll have the response filed with the circuit court inside of 2 weeks." She looked at Edmund Pickett directly. "Mr. Pickett, I'd like to speak with you when you have time. Not about this, about something else, if you're willing." Pickett looked at her, surprised to be addressed. He was a man who expected, she thought, to be part of the background of this interaction. "What about?" "About the fact that Holt's development interest filed against your neighbor's water rights, while also, I believe, doubling the assessed value of your south pasture last fall." Pickett was very still. "How do you know about that?" "Because it's the same pattern," she said, "and I think you already know it." Dole put the paper back in his coat pocket and said they'd be going now. Pickett lingered another moment, looking at Maeve and then at Ronan with the complicated expression of a man reconsidering a position he'd held for years. "End of the week," he said to Maeve. "Come by the South Road." She nodded. Dole walked the men back to the tree line. Maeve and Ronan stood in the clearing and watched them go and didn't say anything until the sound of their boots on the trail had faded into the trees. Ronan's arms were crossed. His jaw was still set. He was breathing through his nose with the deliberate evenness of a man managing something. "The county code," he said. Article 12. "Nora has a copy of the county code at the laundry. I read it 3 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been preparing." "Since the night Cully came up." He turned and looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite gratitude, because gratitude wasn't the shape of it, and not admiration, though it had an edge of that. It was something more like recognition, like a man who had been standing at a problem from one angle for a very long time and had just seen it differently. "Pickett won't be easy," he said. No, she agreed. "But he'll be honest, that's worth more than easy." She turned and went back to the barn, because the goats still needed water regardless of what was happening with the county code, and the afternoon was burning down fast, and there was work to do. Ronan stood in the clearing alone for another minute, looking out at the valley below where Dunmore Flat sat gray and small against the white expanse of the Frostpine Basin, and then he turned and followed her, and picked up a bucket at the barn door without being asked. Edmund Pickett's farm sat on the south road in the way of a man who had decided where he stood and wasn't moving. The house square and low, the barn tight against the hillside, fences that needed some work, but had clearly been good fences once, and would be again if the money came right. Maeve walked the back trail Ronan had shown her, the one that came out below the property line through a stand of bare-limbed cottonwoods, and she arrived at the Pickett door on a Thursday morning with cold cheeks and a clear head. Pickett's wife let her in without warmth, but without hostility either. A woman who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly and reserve judgment until she had reason to spend it. She brought coffee and then left them at the kitchen table, which Maeve understood as a form of courtesy. What happened at this table was Pickett's business. Edmund Pickett sat across from her with both hands around his cup and said, "You knew about the assessment." "I knew Holt uses it," Maeve said. "The pattern is consistent. He inflates the assessed value on property adjacent to what he wants. Makes it harder to hold. When people sell under pressure, he gets his perimeter." "I haven't sold." "I know. That's why I'm here." She wrapped her own hands around her cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and bacon fat, and the particular domestic density of a house where children had been raised, some of them still underfoot. She could hear two of them somewhere in the back of the house, an argument in the half-hearted way of siblings who weren't really angry. "Your son Teddy lost his freighting contract last spring." Pickett's jaw tightened. "That was a business decision by the Harlow Trading Company." The Harlow Trading Company's operating loan was held by a land and finance office in Crestfall. That office is owned by Gareth Holt's brother-in-law. Pickett was very still. "You can prove that?" "The ownership record is in the county filing at Crestfall. Public record. I haven't been there myself yet, but the connection is documented if you know where to look." She paused. "Teddy was the best freighter on the South Road by 3 accounts I've heard. Holt didn't take his contract because of performance." Pickett set his cup down, picked it up again. "What is it you want from me?" "Not a fight," she said. "Not yet. What I want right now is for you to know what you're dealing with. And I want to know if Marcus Greer is as stubborn as people say." Despite everything, Pickett's mouth moved in something close to a smile. "Marcus Greer," he said, "once argued with a blizzard for 3 days, and the blizzard gave up first." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you doing this? You've been on that mountain less than 2 months. It was a fair question, and she gave it a fair answer. Because Holt will take Ronan's land if nobody stops him. And if he takes Ronan's land, he'll have everything he needs to control the North Water and the Valley access. And then everyone who's been careful to stay on his good side will find out there's no such thing as Holt's good side. There's just a longer rope before it runs out. Pickett was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled in the cook stove, and somewhere in the back of the house, the argument between the children reached a brief, inconclusive peak and subsided. "I'll talk to the Weller brothers," he said, "and I can get you to Greer. He won't come to anyone, you'd have to go to him. But if he decides he trusts you, there's nobody in this valley with a longer memory or more to say about Holt's history." "That's all I'm asking," Maeve said. Marcus Greer lived 4 miles east of Dunmore Flats on a piece of land that had been his for longer than most of the valley's current inhabitants had been alive. He was 71, as Nora had said, with the body of a man who had been physically large and strong and had spent the last decade slowly yielding that largeness to time without particularly accepting it. His hands still looked like they could do serious work. His eyes were sharp and unkind in the way of a man who had stopped pretending to be less perceptive than he was sometime around his 40th year. He met Maeve at the gate of his property with his arms crossed and his chin up. Pickett had come with her for the introduction and now stood slightly back, in the role of a man vouching for someone and hoping he hadn't misjudged. "You're the one living with Voss," Greer said, by way of greeting. "I am," Maeve said. "People in town say you're a fool for it. People in town have been wrong about a fair number of things." Greer studied her. "He broke a man's arm. The man was trespassing on his property at the direction of someone who wanted to steal it." She held Greer's gaze. "You've been fighting Holt for 2 years over your grazing land. Has anyone questioned your methods?" "They question everything about me," Greer said, but something had shifted slightly in the set of his mouth. "Then you know what it is to have people decide what kind of person you are before they've looked properly." He uncrossed his arms. "Come in," he said, "both of you." What Marcus Greer had was not just stubbornness. He had records. He'd been keeping them since the first time Holt's man had approached him. A ledger, meticulous and dry, with dates and names and the exact substance of every conversation, offer, and incident. He had the letter Holt had sent through a lawyer in Crestfall offering to purchase his grazing land at a figure that was, Greer said, so insulting he'd kept the letter specifically so he could show people how insulted to be. He had a copy of the county assessor's revised valuation of his land, up by 60% in 1 year, which he'd appealed twice and lost twice to a review board that Maeve now suspected was not reviewing much of anything. He also had something else. "The man Holt sent 2 years ago," Greer said, pulling a sheet from deep in the ledger. "The one who posed as a merchant. Name was Denny Cole. I knew him. He used to work for a mining survey company out of Crestfall before Holt put him on retainer." He placed the paper on the table. On it, in Greer's cramped handwriting, was Cole's name, his connection to the survey company, the dates he'd been seen in the valley. Whatever's under Voss's Northfield, Holt has known about it for at least 3 years, and there's more. He set down a second sheet. "The Frostpine Valley Development Interest. That's Holt's vehicle. He registered it in Crestfall 18 months ago, but I had a nephew look into the registered principals." He tapped the paper. "There are 3 silent partners. One of them is the county assessor. One of them is Sheriff Dole." The kitchen was very quiet. Pickett let out a slow breath. Maeve looked at the paper and read the names twice and felt the shape of it settle into place. The whole careful architecture of it. 3 years in the building, with enough of the county's official machinery inside it to make a legal fight look almost impossible before it started. "The third partner?" she asked. "A man in the territorial capital," Greer said. "I don't know yet what he does or how high it goes. But he has a name on that document, and the document is a public filing, and that means it can be shown to the right people." "The circuit judge," Maeve said. "Judge Aldrin Burr," Greer said. "He comes through in 6 weeks. If someone could get this in front of him before Holt knows it's coming—" "6 weeks is a long time," Pickett said. "Yes," Maeve said. "It is." She came back up the mountain that evening in the dark, later than she'd intended, and Ronan was waiting. Not pacing, not standing at the door. He was at the workbench in the barn when she came in, doing something to a bridle by lantern light. But he looked up immediately when she entered, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders and the way he held the bridle, that he'd been listening for her on the trail for a while. She told him everything. Cole's name, the development interest, Dole and the assessor as silent partners, Greer's records. She laid it out in order, the way she'd laid out the information about the water rights, because he absorbed information better that way than any other way she'd found. He was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he set the bridle down and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the workbench. "Dole," he said. The word came out stripped of almost everything except the recognition of it. "I thought it was just money, that Holt had paid him for convenience." "He owns him," Maeve said, "structurally. Dole can't move against Holt without implicating himself. Which means anything we do legally in this county goes through a man who'll report it back before the ink dries." "Yes." She leaned against the barn wall. "Which means we have to move on 2 tracks simultaneously. The legal track through Burr, that's the long one, and we can't let Holt know it's coming. And the other track," she hesitated. "The other track," Ronan said, "is that he sends men up here before 6 weeks is up." "I think that's likely, yes. Now that he's filed the notice and we've responded, he knows we're not going to fold. Men like Holt have a sequence. Legal pressure first, then something less legal." Ronan picked up the lantern and moved toward the barn door, and she followed him out into the cold. The night was clear and the stars were very bright at altitude, brighter than they ever looked in the flat country, and the mountain was completely silent in the way it got on clear, cold nights, sound absorbed by the snow and the still air. "How many men does he have?" Ronan asked. "Greer thinks between 6 and 10 on regular retainer, more if he brings people in. 6 to 10. He said it thoughtfully, without fear, which she had learned was not bravado but simply the way he processed threats, as a practical problem, with numbers and terrain and options rather than dread. "On my mountain, in winter, they'd have a hard time. You can't fight 10 hired men alone." "I know." He looked out at the valley below, the darkness of it, the few lights of Dunmore Flats far down. "The families, Pickett and Greer and the Wellers, how ready are they?" "Not ready," she said honestly. "Pickett is angry enough, but angry and ready aren't the same. Greer would stand, but he's 71, and the physical side of a confrontation." She stopped. "I'm not trying to build an army. I'm trying to make Holt understand that coming up this mountain has costs he hasn't accounted for." Ronan was quiet. "He won't listen to cost," he said. "Men like that don't stop until there's something they can't get around." "I know," she said. "That's why the judge is the center of it. Greer's records, the development interest filing, the assessor as a partner. If we can get that in front of Burr before Holt moves, we take the legal ground away from him. He can't file against your deed if he's the one being investigated. And if he moves before 6 weeks?" She didn't answer that immediately because the honest answer was that she didn't know yet, and she'd learned that Ronan preferred honest uncertainty to false confidence. "Then we deal with it," she said. He turned and looked at her, and in the lantern light his face was all shadow and angle, the scar catching the light along its length. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the valley, steadily, taking it in, making his assessments. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't admiration. It was more like a question without a question mark. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not letting it run the calendar." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Come inside. It's cold." The bad news came from Cully, as most of the valley's news came, and it came fast. 11 days after Maeve's visit to Greer, Cully appeared at the edge of the clearing in the early morning, before full light, which had never happened before. Maeve was up. She was always up first, and she saw him from the cabin window and went out in her coat to meet him while Ronan was still pulling on his boots inside. The boy's face was tight. "Holt's brought in more men," he said. 6 of them. Came in on yesterday's stage from Crestfall. My mother saw them at the rooming house. They have rifles, proper ones, not working rifles." Ronan appeared in the doorway. "How are they set up?" he asked. "Mrs. Creel gave them the whole upper floor. My mother says Holt was at the rooming house last night, late. She heard him through the laundry wall." Cully looked at Ronan directly. He said they'd be going up the mountain end of the week. He said if you wouldn't sell, it was time to give you a reason to leave. The clearing was very quiet for a moment. A reason to leave. Maeve knew what that phrase meant in the hands of hired men with proper rifles, and from the look on Ronan's face, so did he. End of the week is 3 days, Ronan said. Yes. Does Dole know? Cully's expression answered that before he said anything. Ronan nodded once, slowly. He was looking at the northern tree line again, that habit of his, looking at the terrain when he was thinking about what it meant. And Maeve watched him and thought about 6 men with proper rifles coming up a mountain trail in 3 days, and a sheriff in Holt's pocket, and a judge 6 weeks out, and a collection of frightened valley families who were not yet ready for anything. We need to move the legal piece faster, she said. Burr won't be here for 6 weeks, Ronan said. Burr doesn't come here. Someone brings him the documents. She turned to Cully. How far is it to Crestfall? 2 days by horse in good weather. Cully looked at the sky, which was flat and white with the promise of more snow. Longer now. Who could make that ride? She asked him. Someone Holt doesn't know well enough to watch. Cully thought about it. My uncle, he said slowly, my mother's brother. He's not from the valley. He's passing through, staying with us. Holt doesn't know him. Would he do it for money? He's not a man who needs much convincing for the right thing, Cully said, with the careful precision of a child describing an adult he respected. I think you just have to ask him. Maeve looked at Ronan. Greer's documents. We need copies made today and on the road tonight. Nora can copy them, Ronan said. She's faster than anyone in the valley. I'll go down to Greer for the originals. You stay here. She saw his expression. Not because you can't handle Dunmore Flats, because if Holt's men are in town and they see you on the road, we lose the element of, I know why, he said. He wasn't arguing. He was just looking at her steadily. Come back before dark. She went inside to get her coat and her boots. The good ones, replaced after the first pair gave out, bought from the cobbler in town 2 weeks ago with the last of what she'd brought from home. She pulled them on at the door, and when she straightened up, Ronan was standing in the middle of the cabin with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face she'd never seen before. It was not complicated. It was very simple, actually. The uncovered look of a man who was worried. Not about the mountain or the men coming up it. About her, on the road. She didn't make anything of it. Making something of it would have made him put it away. I'll take the Cottonwood Trail to Pickett's, she said. Pickett can get me to Greer faster than I can walk it alone. I'll be back by dark. There's a loose stone on the Cottonwood Trail, he said. 3rd switchback, left side. It looks solid. I'll watch for it. He nodded. She went out. The day was hard and cold, and it did not go as planned because few things did. Pickett had his own news when she arrived. The Weller brothers had received a visitor the previous evening. A man from Holt's circle who had, very politely, suggested that their water rights dispute with the county might find a quiet resolution if the brothers could find it in themselves to stay uninvolved in affairs on the mountain. The older Weller had showed the man off his property. The younger one was less certain. The younger one is frightened, Pickett said, pulling on his coat to ride with her to Greer's. He's got a wife and 2 young children, and he hasn't slept well since the assessment went up. I'm not going to tell him not to be frightened, Maeve said, but he should know that staying uninvolved won't protect him. It'll just mean he has no hand in how it comes out. At Greer's, the old man had the documents ready. He'd had them ready since their first meeting, she suspected, because he was the kind of man who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask for them. He handed them over with both hands in the deliberate way of someone passing something valuable and looked at her. You know what happens if this doesn't reach Burr, he said. Or if Holt finds out before it does. Yes. And you're still going. I have Cully's uncle riding tonight. Greer looked at her for a long moment. You're not what I expected, he said, when Pickett told me about you. What did you expect? I don't know, something softer. He said it as if soft was a liability and he'd been relieved to find she didn't have it. Take the documents, and take this. He handed her a second, smaller envelope. Letter of my own to Burr. He knows my name. He'll read anything with my signature on it. She took both and put them inside her coat, against her body where the cold couldn't get at the paper, and she thanked him and rode back with Pickett through the gathering afternoon, the sky darkening early the way it did in December, the snow starting again just as she left the South Road and picked up the Cottonwood Trail home. She watched for the loose stone at the third switchback. It was exactly where Ronan said it was. She got back to the clearing just as the light gave out entirely, and Ronan was outside with the lantern, doing something at the woodpile that she suspected was less about the wood than about having a reason to be outside with a lantern. He looked up when she came through the tree line, and she held up the envelope, and he looked at it, and at her, and something went out of his face that had been in it all day. "Cully's uncle?" he said. "Tonight," she said. "Nora has the copies for the circuit court filing. The originals go with him." She crossed the yard, and Greer sent a personal letter. He says Burr knows his name. Ronan held the door open. She went in. The fire was high. He'd built it up while she was gone, more than the evening strictly required. And the cabin was genuinely warm, and she stood close to the hearth and let the cold come out of her coat and her hands and her boots while Ronan poured water for coffee, and neither of them talked for a few minutes. Then he said quietly, "Holt's man was on the South Road this morning." She looked up. "Not near the trail, near the bottom of it." He handed her the cup. He was watching. She thought about that. "He might not have seen where I went." "He might not have needed to," Ronan said. "If Holt already knows you've been talking to Greer, if someone in town put it together, then he knows what we're planning. Then we're in a race." "We're in a race," he said. He sat down across from her at the table in the right place, the ash plank floor solid underfoot. And he looked at the documents in her hand and then at her, and the firelight was warm and uncertain on both their faces. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. Outside, the snow was coming harder now, the frost pines taking it without complaint. And somewhere below them in the dark valley, in the upper floor of Mrs. Creel's rooming house, 6 men with proper rifles were 3 days from a decision that could not be walked back once it was made. And in a cabin on the mountain, 2 people who had found each other at the end of their separate ropes sat with cold coffee and the quiet weight of what was coming and did not flinch from it. The first day passed without incident, which was almost worse than if something had happened. Maeve spent it working. There was always work. The homestead didn't pause for human crises, and she found that the physical labor of it helped, the way hard physical labor sometimes does, by giving the mind something to hold on to that wasn't dread. She recaulked the north wall of the hen coop where a new gap had opened. She took an inventory of the root cellar with more precision than she'd done before, because if things went wrong in the next 48 hours, she wanted to know exactly what they had and for how long. She wrote out, in the account book she'd been keeping since her 3rd week on the mountain, a clean copy of every date and name and action she'd witnessed or been told about regarding Holt and his people, signed it in her own hand, and put it in the tin box with Ronan's deed. Ronan spent the first day on the mountain's high perimeter. He didn't say that's what he was doing. He said he was checking the upper fence line. But she understood that he was reading the terrain, marking in his mind where men would come from and where they wouldn't, and what the snow conditions meant for movement and visibility. He came back at dusk with snow on his coat and a quietness about him that was more focused than his usual quiet. "There's a ridge above the north field," he said over supper. "If men come up the main trail, they come through a choke point below it. 1 man on that ridge can see the whole approach." "1 man on that ridge is separated from the cabin," she said. "Yes. That's not a good position if they split." He ate for a moment. "They won't split on the first pass. They'll come together to make a show of it. Holt's approach is pressure first. He wants to frighten, not fight. The fighting is what happens when the frightening doesn't work. So the first visit is a demonstration. That's my read." He looked at the table. "Which means we have a window. If we can make a counter-demonstration before they decide to escalate." "That's what the families are for," Maeve said. "If Pickett and Greer and the Wellers come up, Greer is 71. Greer with a rifle is 71 years of grievance," she said. "That counts for something." He almost smiled. "Almost. I sent word to Pickett this morning," she said, "through Cully. If Holt's men move on the mountain, Pickett rides to Greer and the Wellers and they come up. Not to fight, just to be present." She paused. "It's harder to do something when there are witnesses who aren't afraid of you." Ronan looked at her. Pickett agreed to this. He said, and I'm quoting accurately, "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to do something besides sit and take it. So yes." Ronan was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "He and I have history." "I know. The fence line." She set her spoon down. "He's setting it aside." "Why?" "Because you didn't engineer his son out of his livelihood. And because I think, when it comes down to it, Edmund Pickett is the kind of man who knows the difference between a neighbor he's had trouble with and an enemy who's been systematically taking this valley apart." Ronan didn't say anything to that, but something in the set of his jaw changed. A slight loosening, the way a thing that has been braced against something relaxes fractionally when the thing pushes back instead of breaks. The men came on the second day. Not the end of the week, 2 days early, which told Maeve something about Holt's confidence, or his impatience, or both. It was mid-morning, the sky flat and white, the kind of winter day that muffles sound and flattens distance and makes the mountain feel both very large and very closed in. She was at the hearth when Ronan came through the cabin door with a controlled speed that she'd learned to read correctly. "6 of them," he said. "Main trail, 20 minutes out." She was already moving. She got her coat. She got the tin box from the shelf. Deed, account book, Greer's copies. She put it under the floorboard below the ash plank, the one that looked solid now but lifted cleanly if you knew where to press. "The ridge?" she asked. "I'm not going to the ridge," he said. "I'm staying in the clearing." She looked at him. "If I'm on the ridge, it's a standoff," he said. "They come in, they can't see me, they do whatever they want in the clearing, and I'm separated from the cabin. If I'm in the clearing, it's a conversation." He paused. "A conversation with a rifle, but a conversation." "And me?" "Beside me," he said. That was never a question. She pulled on her coat and they went out. The clearing was cold and still, and the frost pine stood dark around its edges. She could hear the sound from the trail. Not footsteps, not yet, but the quality of silence that changes when something is moving through it. Ronan stood near the center of the clearing with his rifle in his hand, not raised, just present. She stood to his left, a step back, not because she was behind him, but because that was the position that kept both of them visible and gave neither of them a blind side. They came out of the tree line in the way Ronan had predicted. Together, in a cluster, 6 men in heavy coats with rifles carried openly and with the deliberate casualness of men who had done this before and wanted you to understand that. Their leader was a man she didn't know, heavy-shouldered and flat-faced, with the experienced blankness of a professional who'd been hired for situations exactly like this one. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at Ronan, and then, with visible recalibration, at Maeve. "Voss," he said. "You know my name," Ronan said. "You're on my land. Mr. Holt sent us to—" "I know who sent you." Ronan's voice was entirely level. "Say what you came to say." The man, she'd learned later his name was Pruitt, he'd done similar work in 2 other counties, shifted his weight slightly. "Mr. Holt is prepared to make a final offer on this property. $800, full consideration, clean title transfer within 30 days. He says it's the last offer." "No," Ronan said. Pruitt's eyes moved to Maeve again. "Ma'am, you'd be well served to—" "I live here," Maeve said. "Whatever you're about to suggest I'd be well served to do, I'd save yourself the sentence." Pruitt looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite contempt but was in its general neighborhood. Then he looked back at Ronan. "Mr. Holt has legal standing on the water rights claim. Sheriff Dole has authorized an order to—" "Sheriff Dole," said a voice from the tree line, "doesn't have authorization to authorize anything on this mountain." All of them turned. Edmund Pickett stepped out of the trees on the east side of the clearing. He had a rifle. Behind him came his eldest son, Teddy, the one who'd lost the freighting contract, with another. And from the western tree line, moving slower but without hesitation, came Marcus Greer, with a coat that had seen 40 winters and a rifle that had seen more. Behind Greer were the Weller brothers, both of them, which meant the younger one had made his decision in the night. 7 people. In a clearing on a mountain, in winter light, standing on ground that was not theirs, but that they'd come to anyway. Pruitt looked at the tree line, then at Ronan. Something shifted in his calculation. She could see it happening, the rapid reassessment of a professional who has arrived expecting a certain set of numbers and found a different one. This is an obstruction of a legal process. he said, but the confidence had gone out of the sentence even as he was forming it. Bring the legal process to circuit court, Maeve said. She reached into her coat and produced a single sheet, a copy she'd held back for exactly this purpose. Greer's condensed summary of the development interest filing with the names of its silent partners. She walked forward 3 steps and held it out. This is a record of the Frostpine Valley Development Interest's registered principals. The county assessor is a partner in the company whose claims he's been administering. Sheriff Dole is a partner in the company whose notices he's been serving. That document has already been sent to circuit court for Judge Burr's consideration. She hadn't confirmed that Cully's uncle had made it through. She was working on the assumption that he had, because the alternative was not useful. You are welcome to inform Mr. Holt. Pruitt took the paper. He looked at it. He was a man who understood what he was looking at, she thought. Not the legal details necessarily, but the shape of it. The shape of serious trouble arriving from a direction no one had prepared him for. We'll be going, he said. I know, Ronan said. They went back into the trees. The clearing remained occupied for a long moment by 9 people, and a great deal of held breath. And then Teddy Pickett said, That's it? With a slight deflation of a young man who had psyched himself up for something more dramatic, and Marcus Greer said, That's never it. And both of those things were true. But Holt moved fast after that, faster than she'd expected, which meant she'd underestimated either his intelligence network or his desperation, and she spent the afternoon recalibrating. He came to the mountain himself the next morning, not with Pruitt's men, with Dole and a man she didn't know in a coat that was too good for Dunmore Flats, a crestfall coat, the kind worn by lawyers or by men who kept lawyers close. He came to the edge of the clearing and stopped and looked at the cabin and the barn and the homestead in the way of a man appraising a property he considered already purchased. Holt was not what she had expected from the store, seen at a distance. Up close he was smaller than her memory of him. Not in height, which was average, but in presence. He had the look of a man who was always the most important person in the rooms he chose to be in, and who had organized his life carefully to ensure those were the only rooms he entered. Coming up a mountain in winter to negotiate with a man who'd refused him was not the kind of room Gareth Holt was built for, and it showed in a subtle tightening around his eyes. Ronan stood in the doorway of the cabin. Maeve stood in the clearing, because she'd decided the night before that whatever Holt came to say, she was going to be the one he said it to. Holt looked at her with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he hadn't expected to be an obstacle. I came to speak with Voss. I'm aware of that, she said. Say what you came to say. The woman has no legal standing. She speaks for this household, Ronan said from the doorway, in the flat, unambiguous tone that ended that particular sentence. Holt recalibrated. She could see it happening, and she could see that he didn't like it, and that was fine. The documents you've sent to Burr are based on a fundamental misreading of the partnership filings. My attorneys will have the matter clarified within— Your attorneys, Maeve said, will have a difficult time clarifying a public filing that lists Assessor Crane and Sheriff Dole as registered principals of the development interest that has been filing claims against the properties those same men administer. She kept her voice conversational. Because that's not a misreading. That's the filing. And Greer's letter to Burr includes the original documents, not copies. And the circuit court received them 4 days ago. Holt was quiet for a moment. The lawyer-coated man beside him had gone very still. Whatever you think you have, Holt said, and his voice had changed. The pleasant certainty was still there, surface level, but underneath it something had curdled. It's not going to matter in the long run. This valley is going to be developed one way or another. That mineral seam runs under 3 properties, and this is one of them. And the people who own the other 2 have already agreed, she said, or already pressured? Business is pressure, Holt said. That's all it ever is. Then you understand what this is, she said. She reached into her coat again. She had become, she thought, the woman who was always reaching into her coat, and produced 2 sheets this time. This is a signed statement from Thomas Weller, who runs the sawmill, describing the visit your representative made to his property 3 days ago, and the suggestion that was made regarding his water rights and his non-involvement in affairs on this mountain. He's characterized it as a threat, and he's characterized it accurately, and it's signed and witnessed. She held the second sheet. This is a statement from Edmund Pickett describing the circumstances under which his son's freighting contract was terminated, and the connection between the contracting company's financing and your brother-in-law's office in Crestfall. She extended both papers. You're welcome to these as well, since Burr already has his copies. The lawyer-coated man put his hand on Holt's arm, lightly, the practiced touch of someone who was saying not here, not now, with his fingers. Holt looked at the papers. He didn't take them. He looked at Maeve with an expression that was past the pleasant certainty now and into something more direct. Not quite anger, but the cold version of it, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice because it's thinking about the long game. You don't know how far back I go in this territory, he said, or how many people owe me. I know some of them, she said. The rest I'm still learning. She put the papers back in her coat. But I know this. Whatever is under that north field, it's his. He built this homestead clean, and he's held it 14 years, and there is not a legal mechanism you have that doesn't rest on the corruption of the men you've put in official positions. That's your structure. And it doesn't hold when it's in front of an honest judge. Holt looked past her at Ronan. The look was long and flat and carried in it the weight of a man making a final assessment. This isn't over, he said. No, Ronan said from the doorway. But this part of it is. Holt turned and walked back to the tree line, and the lawyer-coated man went with him, and Dole, who had not said one word during the entire exchange, who had stood slightly back with the look of a man who could feel the ground shifting under his career, went last, and Maeve watched them until the trees took them. Then she turned around and sat down in the snow, heavily, without ceremony, because her legs had been shaking for the last 10 minutes, and she had been standing on will and adrenaline, and they had run out at the same time. Ronan crossed the clearing in 4 strides and crouched in front of her. Are you hurt? No, she said. Just give me a minute. He was quiet. He was close. Closer than he'd been in any non-practical context since she'd arrived. And she was aware of his presence as a physical fact, the warmth of it in the cold air, the solidity of a man who had been on this mountain longer than anything that threatened it. The uncle made it through, he said, to Crestfall. She looked up. You know that? Cully came up while you were at Pickett's yesterday morning. He didn't want to say until it was confirmed. Ronan looked at her steadily. Burr has the documents. He sent a written acknowledgement through the county mail. It came to Nora. She sat with that for a moment. You've known since yesterday. I didn't want to tell you before this morning, he said, in case it changed how you handled it. She understood what he meant. If she'd known Burr had the documents, she might have been slightly less precise, slightly less ready, because the safety net would have been visible. He'd kept it from her not to control her, but to protect the edge she'd needed. That was the right call, she said. I know, he said, without any particular satisfaction in it. She pushed herself up off the snow, and he put a hand under her arm to help, and neither of them commented on it, and she stood upright and brushed the snow off her coat. Dole is done, she said. He knows it. He didn't say one word up there. Dole was done when he saw Greer in the clearing, Ronan said. A man in his position can manage a lot of things, but he can't manage Marcus Greer's 70 years of being known in this valley. She almost laughed. She was getting closer lately to actually laughing. What about the mineral rights? When this is settled, when Burr rules and Holt's claims are thrown out, you're going to have a seam of something valuable under your north field. We, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the north tree line, not at her, in his habit of looking at the terrain when he was saying something that cost him. We have a seam, he said. This is a joint household. That's what we agreed. I'm not going to split what's under the ground from what's above it. She was quiet for a moment, because she didn't know quite what to do with that. Not the legal logic of it, which was straightforward. The other thing, the weight of being included in something by a man who had included no one in anything for 14 years. We'd need to decide carefully, she said, because that was the practical response and the only one she trusted herself with right now. Mining it ourselves would take capital we don't have. Selling the rights to the right party, not Holt, could change what this homestead becomes. I know, he said. It could change it into something you didn't plan on. What I planned on, Ronan said, was to be alone on a mountain until I wasn't. He turned and looked at her directly, in the clear cold light of the December morning. That plan changed about 45 days ago. She held his gaze and he held hers, And neither of them reached for more than that because neither of them was built for more than that right now. But what was there between them in that moment? In the cold clearing on the mountain they had held together against the accumulated pressure of 3 years of Gareth Holt's patience was real. It had been built, the way the homestead had been built, from the working alongside and the early mornings and the tin cups of coffee and the fixed floorboard and the managed fear, and it was as solid as anything on the 40 acres. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make something hot." They went in. Books. The weeks that followed were not clean. No resolution is clean. Joel resigned from his position 11 days after Holt's visit to the mountain, citing health reasons that no one in the valley believed. The county assessor was suspended pending the territorial investigation that Burr's office initiated within a week of receiving the documents. Greer's records had been, it turned out, even more valuable than Maeve had understood, because they contained dates that corresponded to specific assessment changes that could be tied directly to Holt's acquisition timeline. The Frostpine Valley development interest was frozen by court order while the investigation ran. Holt himself did not leave immediately. He stayed at the rooming house for 3 more days, and Maeve heard through Nora that he spent those days in private meetings with the lawyer-coated man, and that he sent 2 letters to Crestfall, and that by the 3rd day he had developed a marked tendency to stare out the rooming house window at the Frostpine Range with the expression of a man counting a loss. He left on a Thursday, on the northbound stage. Cully reported this with a brevity that was entirely in character. "He's gone," was all he said, standing in the clearing with his serious face. Ronan looked at the valley for a moment. "Good," he said. It wasn't triumphant. It was just a word that fit. Edmund Pickett came up to the cabin 3 days after that, on a clear, cold morning, ostensibly to return a tool he'd borrowed from Ronan 2 years ago during the fence line argument. The tool was real, a particular kind of draw knife, but the borrowing of it had occurred during the argument itself, and the return of it now was the kind of errand that isn't about the errand. He knocked at the cabin door and Maeve answered, and he held out the draw knife and said, "I meant to return this." "Come in," she said. He came in. Ronan was at the workbench. He looked at Pickett, and Pickett looked at him, and 2 years of a fence line argument and its accumulated weight sat in the warm cabin between them. "Draw knife," Pickett said. "I see that," Ronan said. "I've had it a while." "You have?" Pickett set it on the table. "That was good work, your wife's work mostly, but you held the ground." "She's not," Ronan started. "She's my wife," Maeve said, from across the room, and both men looked at her. She was looking at the shelf she was rearranging, and she didn't look back. "We married in October. The paperwork is in the tin box." There was a brief silence. Ronan was looking at her with an expression she didn't turn around to see, but she could feel the quality of it. "Well," Pickett said after a moment, "congratulations to you both." "Thank you," Maeve said. She moved a jar of dried beans 2 inches to the left. "Will you stay for coffee?" Pickett stayed for coffee. He and Ronan talked about the fence line, carefully at first, then with increasing directness, in the way men sometimes settle things when there's no longer a reason to let them stay unsettled. They didn't become friends that morning, but they became something in the neighborhood of it, which on a working frontier was often enough. After Pickett left, Ronan stood in the cabin for a moment and looked at Maeve, who was still rearranging the shelf with no apparent intention of addressing what she'd said. "Maeve," he said. "The shelf was inefficient," she said. "That's not—" "I know what you're going to say." She turned around. Her face was composed but not entirely, the way a face is when someone has said something they meant but hadn't planned out loud. "I said we were married because that's what this is. That's what it's been. I'm not asking you to feel something different than you feel. I'm not willing to be the woman who isn't named when a neighbor comes to the door." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was burning steadily behind her, and the winter light came through the window at the angle it came through in December, blue and clean, and the cabin smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the cedar from the blanket chest. "The paperwork," he said, "in the tin box." "Cully's mother witnessed it," she said. "In November. Nora was the second witness." "I didn't know you'd done that." "I know," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd let me if I asked first." He was very still for a moment. And then something happened in his face. Not slow, this time. Not the careful, controlled fractional movement she'd been reading for 2 months. Something more direct and unguarded than anything she'd seen from him. Something that looked, in the December light, like a man arriving at a place he hadn't expected to arrive at, and finding it was all right. "You should have told me," he said, but not angrily. "Yes," she agreed. "I should have." He crossed the room and he put both hands on the shelf she'd been rearranging on either side of her, and he looked at the shelf and then at her, and then he said very quietly, "It is inefficient." She laughed. It was a full, real, unplanned laugh, the kind that happens when you've been holding yourself under careful control for 2 months and something reaches past the careful control and gets at the thing underneath it. She laughed, and he stayed close, and the laugh subsided, and they stood there in the warm cabin on the mountain with the work of what they'd built, and what they'd kept, and what they'd become between them, which was considerable. Outside, the snow held off. The north field lay quiet above the creek, with whatever was beneath it waiting, patient as the mountain itself, for what would come next. Judge Aldrin Burr arrived in Dunmore Flats on a Tuesday in late February, 6 weeks and 3 days after Cully's uncle had ridden through 2 days of deteriorating weather to put Greer's documents in the hands of the circuit court clerk in Crestfall. He came on the southbound stage with 2 clerks and a leather satchel that, Nora reported, he had not let out of his direct possession since boarding. He was a lean man in his late 60s with the kind of face that had been weathered not by outdoors work, but by the particular indoor labor of listening to people tell him things and deciding which parts were true. Maeve had never spoken to a circuit judge before. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things she hadn't done before, by thinking carefully about what the other person needed from the interaction and making sure she could provide it precisely. Burr didn't need her story. He had the documents. What he needed was someone who could answer questions without embroidering the answers, and she could do that. The hearing was not a formal trial. It was a preliminary examination, Burr's term, conducted in the back room of the general store, which was the largest available indoor space in Dunmore Flats that wasn't the rooming house where Holt's people had stayed. Mrs. Adder, who owned the store, had cleared the room without being asked and without comment, which Maeve read as its own kind of statement about how the valley's wind had shifted. Ronan came down the mountain for it. This was not a small thing. The last time he'd been in Dunmore Flats for any purpose other than an emergency was, by most accounts, 3 years prior. He came in with Maeve on the Cottonwood Trail in the morning, and he walked through town without speaking to anyone, and people looked at him the way they always had. But the quality of the looking had changed. It was less certain now. The story they told themselves about Ronan Voss, the monster on the mountain, had developed visible cracks, because the previous 6 weeks had given the valley a great deal to reconsider. Burr examined the documents for 2 hours before he called anyone in. When he called Maeve, he asked her 12 questions, all of them specific, none of them leading, and she answered each one in the same plain language she'd used to write the account in the tin box. When he called Greer, the old man sat across from a circuit judge for the first time in his 71 years and was entirely unintimidated, which seemed to amuse Burr slightly. When he called Ronan, there was a silence in the room that had a texture to it, the accumulated weight of everything the town had decided about this man. And Ronan sat down and answered the questions without ornamentation and without apology. And when Burr asked about the incident with Weston Hale, the collarbone, the survey team, Ronan said, "He was on my land without permission at the direction of a man who wanted my land. I used the force necessary to remove him. I wouldn't do it differently." Burr looked at him for a moment. "You wouldn't use less force?" "No," Ronan said. "I'd use the same amount." Burr wrote something down. Maeve, sitting against the wall, could not tell if this was good or bad, and decided to let it be what it was. The ruling took 4 days, which Burr spent at the rooming house reviewing his notes and conducting 2 additional interviews, one with Edmund Pickett, one with Thomas Weller, the younger brother who had nearly stayed home and hadn't. Maeve spent those 4 days on the mountain in a state of managed suspension, doing the work that needed doing and not talking much about what was happening below. Ronan did the same. They had developed, over the months, a shared capacity for sitting inside uncertainty without tearing at it, which was something neither of them had come to the mountain with. It was something they had learned together, the way most worthwhile things get learned, by necessity and without noticing it was happening. On the fifth morning, Cully came up the trail with a piece of paper in his hand and his serious face arranged in what was, for Cully, an expression of considerable excitement. He held out the paper. Maeve read it. Then she read it again. Burr had ruled. The Frostpine Valley Development Interest's water rights claim was dismissed in full. The counterclaim against Ronan's deed was struck. The assessor's revised valuations on 4 properties, including the Pickett South pasture and both Weller parcels, were ordered, reviewed, and corrected by a court-appointed examiner. Sheriff Dole's resignation was accepted with a formal notation that his conduct was under territorial review. And Burr had referred the matter of the development interest principles to the Territorial Attorney General's office, with a recommendation for investigation into the misuse of county offices for private financial gain. At the bottom of the ruling, in Burr's own handwriting rather than his clerk's, the mineral rights pertaining to the north field of the Voss property remain with the registered deed holders in full and without encumbrance. Maeve stood in the clearing holding the paper, and the cold February air came down from the upper mountain and moved through the frost pines, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not relief exactly, because relief implies you'd been holding your breath, and she'd been too busy to hold her breath. Something more like arrival. The particular feeling of reaching the place you've been walking toward without being sure the ground would hold. Ronan read the ruling standing beside her. He read it slower than she did, going through every sentence, and when he finished, he stood there for a moment with the paper in his hands and said nothing. Then he looked at Cully. "Tell your mother thank you," he said, "for all of it." Cully nodded with great seriousness. "She said you'd say that. She said to tell you that you're welcome, and also that the account of legal fees for the document copying is in the mail." He paused. "She wanted you to know she was joking." "She can charge what she wants," Ronan said. Cully looked at him. "She really was joking." "I know," Ronan said. "Tell her anyway." Spring came late to the Frostpine Range, as it always did, arriving in the second week of April as a kind of gradual relenting rather than a change. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the creek running louder under its thinning ice shelf, the frost pines releasing that particular smell they had when the cold broke, something between cold water and living wood that Maeve had come to understand over the months as the smell of the mountain waking up. The mineral seam in the north field turned out to be lead-silver ore, as she'd suspected. A decent deposit, not a fortune in itself, but substantial enough to matter. They had a surveyor up from Crestfall in March, an independent one with no connection to Holt or the development interest, and he'd assessed the extent of it and given them a number that sat in the tin box alongside the deed and the account book and the marriage record. They talked about it for 2 weeks before they decided. This was, Maeve had come to understand, how decisions got made in a functional partnership, not quickly, not dramatically, but through the accumulation of conversations had at the table and at the workbench and over supper. The idea turned in the light from different angles until you could see it clearly enough to act on it. They would not mine it themselves. They lacked the capital and the expertise, and more than that, they lacked the inclination. They had both come to this mountain, for different reasons and from different distances, to build something quiet and their own, and a working mine was neither of those things. What they would do was lease the rights, carefully, to a company that Burr's clerk had recommended. A legitimate operation out of the territorial capital with a clean record, on terms that Maeve negotiated herself over 6 days of correspondence and 2 face-to-face meetings in Crestfall. The terms were good, not extravagant. She hadn't tried for extravagant, because extravagant draws the kind of attention she'd had enough of, but solid, with a royalty structure and a lease period and clear conditions about the creek and the topsoil and what happened to the land when the operation ended. The company's man in Crestfall had looked at her across the table with the expression she'd seen before on men who had expected something other than what they got, and she had looked back without apology, and they had shaken hands on it. When she came back up the mountain and told Ronan the terms, he sat with them for a long moment. "That's fair," he said finally. "That's more than fair." "It's what it's worth," she said. "Not more, not less." He looked at her. "You could have gotten more." "I could have pushed harder," she said. "There's a difference. Push too hard on a fair deal and it stops being a fair deal, and then you're in a different kind of relationship with the people you're depending on to handle your land right." She poured coffee for both of them. "We're going to be their landlords for 20 years. I'd rather they feel they were dealt with honestly." Ronan drank his coffee and thought about that. That's how you think about most things, he said. It wasn't a criticism. It was something closer to understanding arriving in words. It's how I've had to think about most things, she said. When you don't have the advantage of size or position, you'd better be right about what's fair. It's the one thing people can't argue with once they've seen it. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you thought about me when you came up here? She considered the question honestly. I thought you'd been decided about badly, she said, by people who mistook your edges for your whole shape. She looked at her cup. I do think that sometimes people earn their reputation. You're not easy, but you're not what they said you were either. There's a space between those things, and that space was where I thought, maybe. Maybe, he repeated, with something in it that was almost wry. It was a well-founded maybe, she said. It worked out. He set his cup down. It did, he said, plainly without fuss, which was the highest form of agreement available from Ronan Voss. And she had learned to hear it for what it was worth. 1. The valley changed after Holt left, though not all at once and not without friction. That is the nature of a community that has been organized around someone else's interests for years. It doesn't immediately become something better just because the organizing force is removed. It takes time to remember what it was before, or to figure out what it wants to be next. Casper Dole's replacement was a man named Fenn, younger, from outside the valley, with no existing loyalties to manage. He was not remarkable, but he was honest, which after Dole was sufficient to count as a recommendation. The assessor's office was reconstituted under the court examiner's oversight, and the 4 properties whose valuations had been inflated were corrected, and the Weller brothers' water rights dispute was resolved in their favor by an actual reading of the county code, which turned out to contain exactly the provision Maeve had cited to Dole on the mountain 9 months before. Teddy Pickett got his freighting contract back. This happened because the Harlow Trading Company's financing arrangement with Holt's brother-in-law's office was dissolved when the brother-in-law was included in the Territorial Attorney General's investigation, and the new financing arrangement had no particular interest in who drove what wagon on what road. Teddy was the best freighter on the South Road, and practical men hired the best freighter available. Maeve heard about it through Nora and felt something simple and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of a cause and effect working the way it was supposed to. Marcus Greer came up the mountain in May, which surprised everyone, including Pickett, who had said the man didn't go to anyone. He came on a gray horse with a bad temperament that suited him, and he arrived at the clearing and looked around at the homestead, the tight cabin, the solid barn, the lean-to with its new supply of split wood, the kitchen garden that Maeve had put in that spring along the south-facing slope where the sun came first. And he said to no one in particular, "Better than I expected." "I'll take that," Ronan said. Greer dismounted and handed Maeve a paper bag. Inside was a jar of honey from his own hives and a folded letter. "From Burr," he said. "He writes me occasionally. Apparently he found this case interesting." Maeve opened the letter. Burr had written 2 paragraphs, careful, spare sentences that said, in effect, that the investigation had expanded, that 2 more of Holt's operations in neighboring counties had come under review, and that Holt himself had relocated to somewhere in the Eastern Territories, away from the jurisdiction. He also said in a final sentence that she read twice, "The woman who organized the documentation presented to this court should know that she did it correctly. In 20 years on this circuit, I have seen many people attempt to pursue legitimate grievance through legal channels and fail because they lacked either the precision or the patience. She had both." She folded the letter and put it in her coat. "Good news?" Greer asked. "Confirmation," she said. "Which is different." Greer looked at her with those sharp, unkind eyes that were only unkind because they saw clearly. "You're not what this valley expected," he said. "I know," she said. "People keep telling me." "I mean it differently than they do," he said. "They expected nothing. I expect you'll matter here for a long time." It was the most direct compliment she'd received since arriving in the Frostpine Range, and it came from the hardest source available, and she received it the way Greer would have wanted it received, without performance, without deflection. "Thank you," she said. "Will you stay for supper?" Greer stayed for supper. He and Ronan talked for 3 hours about the valley, about the land, about the mountain and its history, and the history before that. Maeve listened and occasionally contributed and watched the 2 of them, The 71-year-old man who had held his land through sheer obstinacy, and the 40-something mountain man who had held his through sheer isolation, and thought about what it meant that these two people were sitting at her table in a room that had been a silent man's fortress 6 months ago. It meant something had shifted, not just the legal situation or Holt's departure or the ruling in their favor. Something underneath that. The way a place that has been contracted around a wound begins, slowly and imperfectly, to relax. There's a thing that happens to people who survive a long pressure. Not a single crisis, but the sustained kind. The kind that has no dramatic moment of arrival, just a gradual constriction until you're living inside a space that has become very small. When the pressure releases, there is a period that is strange and disorienting, because you are still shaped, for a while, by the thing that was pressing on you. You still flinch at sounds that no longer mean anything. You still plan for contingencies that no longer exist. Maeve understood this because she had been carrying a particular pressure for more than 2 years before she came up the mountain. The accumulated weight of being turned down and looked past and assessed and found wanting by the specific measure that the world had decided to use for her. She had carried it with a kind of hard practicality that she was proud of, because you had to be proud of it, or it would break you. But she had carried it nonetheless, and it had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. On a morning in June, she was in the kitchen garden when she heard Ronan come out of the barn. She looked up at him across the clearing, and he looked back at her, and there was nothing particular in the look. No crisis, no agenda, just the ordinary fact of two people who had ended up on the same mountain looking at each other across a June morning with the frost pines dark behind him and the kitchen garden soft with new growth around her. She felt in that moment something she couldn't have described precisely to anyone. The absence of the waiting. The absence of the provisional quality that had lived in her chest for 2 years. The sense of herself as a person in temporary circumstances. Someone whose life was contingent on someone else's decision about whether she was worth anything. She was here. This was her life. It was not the life she had imagined. She hadn't imagined well enough, it turned out, to get close to this. But it was hers, stitched together from a broken trunk and a hard trail and a tin cup of bad coffee and a man who'd said, "Come into a woman he didn't know," and meant it more than he understood at the time. She went back to the garden. Ronan crossed the clearing and crouched at the garden's edge, looking at the rows. He was not a man who gardened. He'd made that clear, though without prejudice against the activity, but he had a habit of checking on things that mattered to him under the cover of practical interest. "The beans are coming," he said. "I know. They're a week ahead of where I thought they'd be." She was on her knees in the dirt, working a row with a hand tool. "The south slope gets more sun than I accounted for." "I told you it did." "You said it got good morning light. That's not the same as telling me it would move the beans a week." He looked at the beans. "I should have been more specific." "You should," she agreed. She worked for a moment. "Ronan, I want to put a window on the south wall of the cabin. A real one, not just a shutter port, big enough to let the afternoon light in." He was quiet, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking about something rather than just not talking. "That's a structural cut," he said. "I know, I can help. It would take 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks. He looked at the south wall of the cabin, the one that caught the afternoon sun, and she could see him seeing it, the window that wasn't there yet, the light that would come through it. "All right," he said. She kept working the garden row. He stayed crouched at the edge, not going anywhere in particular, just present, in the way he had of being present that she had come to depend on, without noticing the dependence form. This is the thing that doesn't get said often enough about what courage actually looks like in a life. It is not usually the moment in the clearing when the men with rifles come out of the trees. That is one kind of courage, and it matters, but it is not the kind that shapes the architecture of a life. The kind that shapes a life is smaller and harder to see. It is the decision to walk up a mountain alone after 9 rejections and knock on a stranger's door. It is the decision to stay the night and then stay the next night and the one after. It is the decision to move the table 4 feet to the left and fix the floorboard and learn the language of a person who doesn't have much language to give, and to keep learning it when it doesn't come easily, because the person behind the language is worth the difficulty. Maeve Holloway had not come to the Frostpine Range to save anyone. She had come because she needed a situation, and she had found one that suited her particular strengths, and she had worked it with everything she had because that was the only way she knew how to work. that the working had changed a man, changed a valley, changed the legal standing of 4 families and the careers of 2 corrupt officials, and the direction of Gareth Holt's life. None of that had been the plan. The plan had been, be useful, be honest, don't flinch. The rest had followed. And Ronan Voss, the man who had come to a mountain to be left alone and had been left alone for 14 years, while the aloneness slowly became a kind of armor that he'd forgotten was not the same thing as a life. He had opened a door in the snow to a woman who asked plain questions and moved furniture without permission and fixed things that needed fixing, and he had discovered, at a pace that suited him, that the armor had been covering something that was still alive. Neither of them had rescued the other. That is the important part. People who rescue each other build a debt that sooner or later has to be settled, and the settling is never clean. What they had done was something simpler and rarer. They had each shown up fully, with their actual capabilities and their actual limitations, and they had found that the capabilities matched the requirements and the limitations could be worked around. The territory investigation concluded in August, nearly a year after Maeve had walked up the mountain. Gareth Holt was formally charged with 2 counts of fraudulent land acquisition and 1 count of conspiracy to misuse county office. He was in the Eastern Territories, and the jurisdiction was complicated, and whether justice would travel that far was, as Greer said when he heard, a matter of some uncertainty. But Assessor Crane served 4 months in the county jail. The development interest was dissolved. The properties that had been manipulated were restored. It was not perfect. It was not the clean conclusion that the story, if you told it a certain way, might seem to be heading toward. Some of the damage Holt had done to the valley didn't reverse when he left. The Ferris family had already sold and moved east and didn't come back, and the Kellner strip sat unused for 2 more years before someone bought it honestly. The younger Weller brother had a hard winter that year and nearly lost the mill anyway, through no one's fault but a bad ice storm and a run of bad luck that had nothing to do with Holt and everything to do with the ordinary cruelty of the frontier. Life on the mountain did not become easy. It became sustainable, which is different and in many ways better, because sustainable is something you can actually plan around. By the following spring, the mining operation had begun on the North Field, careful, contained, run by people who understood what they'd agreed to, and the royalty payments came quarterly and were real. Maeve put most of it back into the homestead in the first 2 years. The south window got built, the barn roof was replaced properly. A second structure went up for storage that had been needed since before she arrived. The kitchen garden expanded. The goats were joined by 2 more, which Ronan expressed his continued philosophical objections to, and she listened to his objections and ordered the goats anyway. They never became soft with each other. That was not who they were. They argued sometimes about the garden, about the finances, about a fence line of their own once, which they resolved in 3 hours by the simple method of both of them being right about different parts of it. They were not always easy, but they were, consistently and without reservation, on each other's side, and in the long run, that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Cully grew up. This is what children do, but it is still worth noting. He grew up into a young man who was serious and precise and better educated than most of his contemporaries because Maeve had, beginning in his 12th year, taught him formally 2 mornings a week at the cabin table, from her own books and her own knowledge. He was quick with figures and quicker still with the kind of reading that required you to understand what the document was trying to hide as well as what it was trying to show. He would in time become the kind of man the valley needed, someone who understood its history and its mechanisms, and who had been taught early that the right thing and the practical thing were not always different things. Nora Pell said one afternoon in Maeve's second summer on the mountain, when they were sitting at the laundry in the particular domestic peace of 2 women who have been through something together and come out the other side. "You know what they say about you in town now?" "I can imagine," Maeve said. "They say you're the one who ran Holt out." "We ran Holt out," Maeve said. "All of us. Greer and Pickett and your brother and the Wellers." That's not as good a story," Nora said. "Good stories and true stories aren't always the same shape." Nora looked at her sideways with that particular expression she had that was mostly affection with a thin layer of exasperation over it. "Let me tell you something," she said. "I've lived in this valley my whole life. I've watched what happens to the people who get in the way of the Holts of this world. Most of them move, or they stay and they get small. They just make themselves smaller and smaller until there's not enough of them left to threaten anything." She folded a shirt with careful, practiced hands. You didn't do either of those things. You came up here with a broken trunk and nothing promised, and you just refused to be small. That's the whole story. That's all it was. Maeve thought about that for a moment. About being 12 years old and being told she would have to work harder than other girls. About 9 letters and 9 careful phrasings around a single blunt truth. About the trail up the mountain in December's snow, her lungs burning and her heels split and the trunk heavy and the light going, and the decision, it was a decision, even if it hadn't felt like one at the time, to keep going. I was afraid the whole time, she said. I want you to know that, in case it matters. It's more interesting that way, Nora said. They sat in the warm laundry for a while longer, with the sounds of the town coming through the walls, and the frost pine range visible through the small east window, dark and steady on the horizon. Up on the mountain, the south window of the cabin let in the afternoon light the way Maeve had known it would. The table sat in the right place. The floorboard was solid underfoot. The kitchen garden came back every spring a little fuller than the last, the way gardens do when someone tends them with attention and patience and no particular expectation of perfection. And the mountain, which had been called dangerous and isolating and the home of a man the valley feared, turned out to be the same mountain it had always been. Stone and timber and cold water over old rock, indifferent in the way of large things that simply exist and let the people on them decide what they're going to make of the time they're given. What they made of it was this: a life, built by hand, by 2 people who had each been told in different ways that they were not quite enough. The telling had been wrong. It is usually wrong, about people who are willing to walk up the mountain anyway.